All right, I want to briefly go over at a very high level the first three units from AP US Government and Politics. So again, this is going to be at the very high level so we can get an overarching understanding, and certainly we will also need to spend some time with our required cases and our required documents. All right, constitutional foundations. So the US Constitution arose out of an important historical and philosophical ideas and preferences regarding two things: popular sovereignty and limited government. As we'll see here, compromises were made during the Constitutional Convention and certainly in the ratification debates in the various states. These, these compromises have frequently been the source of conflict going forward in US politics over how we balance between individual freedom, social order, and equality of opportunity. The first semblance of national government here in the United States, created after independence, breaking away from England, was, as you remember, very state-centered, a decentralized system, a confederation, if you will, under the Articles of Confederation. And it reflected really the fear of the day of a very powerful central government. But it was the lack of powers coming from the National Congress, the national government, together with the ability and the actual practice of each state doing whatever they wanted, oftentimes in conflict with each other, that raised concerns that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, among others, as to whether the Articles of Confederation was going to work to this new nation going forward. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation led to a call for change and a decision to host a convention, initially at least, to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you remember, the convention itself was held in Philadelphia. And if you think about it, if you look at it at the high level, it truly was a triumph of negotiation, collaboration, and compromise. We probably wouldn't have ended up with that document without those present being able to exercise each of these skills. Certainly went beyond the initial mandate, and some still argue that historically it has sort of a hint of illegality because they weren't necessarily authorized to come up with an entirely new document. But nonetheless, it leads to the creation of a new constitution that very impressively grants more centralized authority from a national government, divides the power among three separate branches in the national government, and reserves powers and authority to the states. So it's not, the national government isn't necessarily going to overpower the states. So amazing that we ended up with something that has this very delicate balance. The group that favored the new federal constitution, the Federalists, argued that the constitutional separation of powers and also the checks and balances each branch has against the other would be enough to protect people from the governmental tyranny and also to be able to bring the nation together. The Federalists also argued that although the Constitution didn't explicitly list rights that were held by individuals, it did protect civil liberties in general by limiting the national government to those powers that were enumerated. By contrast, on the other side, the anti-federalists argued that against the new federal system, claiming that any new constitution would erode this traditional sovereignty and power of the states, that the prominence of local self-government and the inherited liberties, as the document lacked specific listing of rights needed to protect the people from a national government. So they wanted to have those rights listed. The Federalists ultimately promised the Anti-Federalists that once ratification is made, very quickly, swiftly thereafter, they would support the addition of a Bill of Rights that would enumerate those rights that are held by individuals. So the Constitution was ratified in 1788 by the requisite number of states. Although the last states, again, Rhode Island's always that holdout, they didn't participate in the convention either. They didn't ratify until 1790. The Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, which are so vitally important to the U.S. Constitution, were ratified in 1791. More than 200 years after it becomes active and it becomes our Constitution, those compromises that were necessary in order to get the Constitution ratified, and in some cases led to ambiguity, continue to fuel the debate today in the 2000s, and sometimes even conflict over how best we protect liberty, equality, order, and private property. So let's talk about the big ideas in Unit 1. So the first big idea, this balance between governmental power and individual rights, it's been the hallmark of American political development since the beginning. And we talk about these three kinds of democracy. So you've got at one end of the extreme participatory democracy, where all members of a group or community participate in decisions and every member has a vote. We talked about how in many ways that's impractical to do. Pluralist democracy, a model of democracy that stresses vigorous competition among various interests in a free society. And then at the other extreme, elite democracy, where the privileged classes get the power to decide by a competition for people's votes and have significant freedom between elections to rule as they see fit. And if you'll remember, the debate between two of those required documents, Federalist 10 and Brutus number 1, talks about this tension between a broad participatory model of participatory democracy and the more filtered participation of the pluralist and the elite models. So we'll come across those themes again as we look at those documents specifically. Second big idea, the Constitution emerged from the debate about the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation as a blueprint for limited government. So one thing it's important to remember is this idea and the evolution of factions, the origins of political parties, those political groups that agree on objectives and policies. And again, in this case, we have two factions. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the main idea, again, of the Federalists found in Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, reasons to ratify the Constitution. They believe the Constitution is the best way to deal with and to manage what they consider the tyranny of the majority. Number one, by creating these three branches of government that each have distinctive and in many cases separate powers. And to one additional thing, for example, the Electoral College to protect against the tyranny of the majority. Anti-Federalists, again, really only read Brutus 1 in terms of representing the ideas of the Anti-Federalists, but indicative of their reluctance to ratify the Constitution. They believe the Constitution gave too much political, economic, and military control to a national government. They, in many ways, favored a more decentralized government structure where most of the power resided in the states. So a lot closer on that spectrum to the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you remember the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, there certainly were many. There was no judicial branch. It had very weak economic powers, including no power to tax. There was no executive. There was no military, and it was a unicameral legislature, and it required significant support in that unicameral legislature to pass legislation and to change or amend the articles. So we mentioned that the U.S. Constitution was a series of compromises, and it's important to look back over those because those help explain how we ended up where we are. As I mentioned early on, compromises really were necessary in order to get this document adopted, to get it ratified by the requisite number of states. So the first compromise is the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. Remember, we had two plans. There was first the Virginia plan, the large state plan. Basically, they had larger populations. They wanted to have a legislature that reflected proportional representation based on population, which would give the large states a greater say, a greater voice. On the other end of the extreme, you have the New Jersey plan, which calls for each state, regardless of size, to have equal representation. So what we end up with is the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, which agrees to a bicameral legislature. One of those bodies would be equal representation, regardless of state size, and the other would be proportional representation based on population. Another compromise, the Electoral College. Presidential electors from each state, the number of electors based on the state's population. The candidate with the majority of the electoral votes wins. And again, this is something of a protection against the tyranny of the majority, which is something they were afraid of if they had a pure popular vote process. The 3/5 compromise. Remember, states in the South, although they didn't want to give slaves the right to vote, certainly, but they did want to get credit for them being members of the population. And of course, those states in the North that didn't have large slave populations didn't feel it was appropriate to have slaves count toward their number of representatives in Congress. So we ended up with this goofy thing called the 3/5 compromise. So every 5 slaves would count as 3 people, or every individual slave as 3/5 of a person for both representational purposes, but also for tax purposes. And we also have sort of the kicking can down the road on slavery in the U.S. And this is one of the early actions along those lines. So the confirmation on the importation of slaves. The South stated that if slaves were banned, they wouldn't ratify the Constitution, and it was decided the compromise would be they would wait 20 years before Congress would take any action relative to the importation of slaves. And to their credit, in 1808, the Congress did act as soon as it was able to ban the importation of slaves into the United States. Certainly not the slave trade within, but the importation of slaves. So the debate over the role of the national government, the central government, and the powers of the states' governments, the rights of individuals, continues in the 2000s to be the heart of the constitutional issues about democracy and governmental power. For example, governmental surveillance resulting from the federal government's response to the 9/11 attacks. The Patriot Act, for example, increased invasion in the minds of many into the privacy interests of individuals. And we're going to see this again as we develop response plans to COVID-19. Are people going to be willing to give up some level of their privacy, maybe even to let a central authority know where they are to see if they're in the proximity of someone who's tested positive for COVID-19? So again, these issues continue to be paramount and front and center in the 2000s. All right, big idea number 3. The Constitution created a competitive policy-making process to ensure people's will is represented and that freedom is preserved. So we have this concept, Montesquieu's concept of separation of powers. So constitutional division of powers among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, where the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive applies and enforces the law, and the judiciary interprets the law. The checks and balances, a system that allows each branch of the government to limit or in some ways control or put a check on abuse of powers by the other branches. And we've talked about several examples of that. Big idea number 4, federalism, and this certainly is something that is relevant in 2020. Federalism reflects the dynamic distribution of power between national and state governments. And we talked about the different types of power that the government has, governments have, whether it's national or state. So just to talk through this real quick, we've got the expressed powers or the enumerated powers of the national government. So powers explicitly given to Congress in the Constitution. For example, powers to levy taxes, powers to regulate commerce and currency, powers to declare war and raise an army, the authority over the U.S. Navy, the power to allow foreigners to become citizens. We have concurrent powers, so powers that are shared between the national government and the state governments. So powers held jointly by those two. For example, collecting taxes, borrowing money, setting up court systems. So we have a state court system, we have state court systems, and we have a federal court system. Creating laws that maintain health, safety, and welfare. Setting a minimum wage, and chartering banks. Third column, reserved powers. So these are powers that are reserved to the states, and we'll talk about it in more detail, but the 10th Amendment. So powers not specifically granted to the federal government or denied to the states by default belong to the states and to the people. For example, regulating trade within a state. Marriage laws, so the age of marriage and other laws relating to marriage. The conduct of elections, and we've certainly seen that play out in the spring of 2020, and we'll see it again as we move into the 2020 elections in November. A lot of state-by-state control. Is it going to be mail-in? Is it going to be early voting? What's the process going to be for that? And then establishing local government, whether it's a state, county, township, city, municipality, something along those lines. And then the last category are the implied powers, and these would be implied powers of the national government. So powers that are inferred from the express powers that allow Congress to carry out its functions. So again, more detail, this is a power that's not explicitly granted in the Constitution in direct verbiage, but it's implied by the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause to be delegated for the purpose of carrying out one of those enumerated powers. So specifically, I mentioned it in the previous slide, there's the 10th Amendment, which reserves certain powers to the states. So this establishes the general idea of federalism, state power, federal power. The Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate all business activities that cross state lines or affect more than one state or nation. So this deals with the balance of power between the federal and the state government. And the Commerce Clause is one of those avenues that has expanded the power of the federal government tremendously, especially when you put on top of it the necessary and proper clause, which allows Congress, again, to make laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its explicit powers in the Constitution. And by and large, it's been the necessary and proper clause that has expanded federal authority and federal power without too many limits, although we did talk about some. And then one last thought to leave you with here, and we looked at this in a couple of the articles that I've had you read over the last several weeks. So think about COVID-19 and how it relates to federalism. What is the role of the federal government? What is the role of the state governments? And this article here in this Stanford publication is a very good article if you want to read more about that. But in practice, this is a good exercise in understanding what federalism is, or at very least maybe what federalism should be.